Hello, thank you so much. It's always a real honor to be invited to speak to the Tamarisk Symposium. Thank you to the Tamarisk Coalition for all of your wonderful work. I'm going to talk a little bit about work that's been going on in my lab at the University of Denver for the last 8.5 years. We've been very interested in what happens after you take tamarisk out, and I want to talk to you today about regional differences in what happens when you take tamarisk out. I always like to start my talk with my acknowledgments. I want to particularly thank the Nature Conservancy and Peter Mueller, who are here, the Branson Chinchilla Conservation District, Shelley Simmons and Patty Knapp are here today, and Big Loud. It's a real honor to get to work with folks like you and other folks who may be here that are partners. But I really want to make sure that you know that the work I'm going to be presenting here is primarily that of my students, both graduate students and undergraduates. I really deserve very little credit for what you're going to see today. These are the guys, especially Hisham El-Wayar, who is here today. So the paradox of tamarisk, as you may be aware, is that it seems to do things at all ends of the spectrum. Is it a big water user or a little water user? Is it good or is it bad for wildlife? Is it a passenger or is it a driver of ecosystem change? And will taking it out mean that you get natives, that you get your desirable species? And the answer to all of these questions really is it depends. One of the main things that it depends on, as it turns out, of course, is water availability. Tamarisk behaves very differently in very arid environments versus more mesic ones. So if we just take water use as an for example, we know that in more arid locations, tamarisk uses less water than in places where it has access to more water. It uses more water. And in arid regions, it's more likely to be the only tree growing or one of the only trees growing, maybe because historically no trees have grown there, or because conditions have changed, and now tamarisk is one of the only trees that will grow there, in contrast with places that will support a wider variety of trees, including cottonwoods and willows. So we see tamarisk, of course, behaving in lots of different ways and growing in lots of different kinds of environments. And these kinds of changes, we're looking here at the Middle Rio Grande, where we have the most impressive infestations that I've seen. But then you have like the San Pedro, where it's an understory under mature cottonwood trees. So some of these differences are somewhat characteristic of regions. And so understanding regional differences matters with regard to being able to extrapolate results. So if you see somebody talking about tamarisk behaving in a certain way or something that happened in a restoration project in a certain location, that doesn't mean necessarily that you can extrapolate, right, if regions differ. And primarily the interest that we're going to talk about today is, doesn't mean that the same things happen when you take tamarisk out in different regions. Now, most of the research that's been done on tamarisk and restoration after tamarisk removal has taken place in two regions, what I'll refer to and has been referred to as the Chihuahuan-Transition and the Mojave-Sonoran. So we're looking at more and more work coming out of the Colorado Plateau and other regions around in there, but the majority of what we know is coming out of these two places. So does tamarisk behave the same in those two places? Well, they're very different places, right? Water availability in particular differs very strongly between Mojave-Sonoran and the Chihuahuan-Transition zones in terms of not only precipitation, but also in terms of perennial flow. And as a consequence of this, you see those really impressive, thick, tall stands in the Chihuahuan-Transition that are much less likely to be found in the Mojave-Sonoran region. You're more likely there to find smaller trees, more sparse populations, more mixed populations. And not only are these areas different in their climate and their weather, soils and other adaptive factors, but as it turns out, the trees themselves are different in these different regions. This is work done by John Gaskin and Barbara Shaw on the genetics of these plants. And what we see is in the Chihuahuan-Transition, it's dominated by tamarisk chinensis. As the name implies, it is from China, including very dry regions of China. These are very drought-adapted plants, and they were planted very extensively as a stream bank stabilizer in this region. So they were given a great opportunity to become invasive. And you can see that they are, because it's not just pink, it's mixed in with some other colors. That means hybrids. So it looks like the hybrids that exist in this area are not only drought adapted, but also are able to take advantage of water when it's there. That's in contrast with the predominance of blue, which represents tamarisk ramosissima in the Mojave Sonoran. Tamarisk ramosissima is the one that's been planted mostly as an ornamental. When you plant trees as ornamentals, you're not planting them the same way as when you're using them as a stream bank stabilizer, right? You have a tree here, tree here, tree here. And the tamarisk ramosissima are from the Middle East and with more Mediterranean climates. So these are actually more mesic adapted genotypes than the tamarisk chinensis. And of course, that's the opposite of what the climates are, right? It's drier over here than over here. So we may have a mismatch in genotypes, which also may account for the reason why these trees over here aren't acting as crazy as the ones over here. So what we're really interested in is, do these differences in climate and genotype translate into differences when you remove the tamarisk, differences in plant community that come in? And that's where our work comes in, measuring plant communities where restoration is taking place. So one of the ways of doing this is looking at past restoration projects. I had a master's student, Robin Bay, who took this on as her thesis work. And concurrently with Robin's work, Rebecca Harms was also doing a thesis looking at plant communities after tamarisk was being removed. These are the 28 sites that Robin Bay did. Rebecca Harms and her advisor Ron Hebert had sites also in the Colorado Plateau. The difference between the two projects being that Rebecca Harms was looking at places where there was only passive revegetation. They took the tamarisk out, no plantings were done. Robin was looking at places where there were plantings done, but no supplemental irrigation. And she wasn't able, at that time, she wasn't able to find any sites in the Colorado Plateau that did that. I ended up having another staff person at the Denver Botanic Gardens look at Colorado Plateau later. But the thing that really stuck out for me about the Harms and Hebert work and then in my student Robin's work was that the response to tamarisk removal was not the same everywhere. What we're looking at here is my adaptation of one of their figures that shows native cover on our y-axis. And I just pulled out the Mojave and the Chihuahuan-Transition sites here, where the red represents where the tamarisk was left intact, and the blue is where the tamarisk was removed. And we see that natives did increase in cover in both regions, but it was important to note that that difference was only statistically significant in the Mojave Sonoran area. And although you saw the mean response increase, there was so much variability in the transition, in the Chihuahuan-Transition, that difference was not statistically significant. And it was the same for the Colorado Plateau. There were fewer sites where we had good recovery of tamarisk removed. And so in both cases, there was no statistical difference there. So what does that mean? It means that the response of native species was more consistently positive in the Mojave Sonoran region. And Robin Bay's work was also able to identify what adaptive factors, what things in the environment were helping to predict where tamarisk was not coming in, where the natives were doing well. And she found that sort of ironically, it was really, but not surprising, it was water that was the big feature. Low salinity, low pH, and having access to water promoted the native species, and exactly the opposite, were promoting the more noxious species and promoting tamarisk to come back in, high salinity, high pH, far from water, all these stressful conditions. So looking at some photographs of those sites that Robin looked at, these are in the Chihuahuan-Transition. We see high variability. Some sites didn't do so well, other sites were doing well. The common factor was that these sites were most often being restored with very mesic species. They're putting in cottonwood poles, they're trying to get these more wet-adapted plants to come in. And obviously in places where it was too dry to support them, it wasn't succeeding. So it seemed that there was this insistence on putting this particular plant community in, and sometimes the environment did not support it. Oops. In the Mojave, we also saw variability, but very often the plants that were coming in, the plants that were seeded and the plants that were, the natives that were just passively coming in, were more drought-adapted species. And I think that accounted for the more consistent success that we saw in the Mojave, that where the environment didn't support mesic species, there wasn't an attempt to get those back in. Of course, there are more mesic sites there as well, and there were some failures there too. But those, again, had to do with water availability and the matching of what the natives would tolerate with what water was available. So the paradox that the Mojave is a harsher environment, a drier environment, but that the natives were coming back, I think has to do with this matching of plants with water availability, while the Chihuahuan and Colorado Plateau found more variable responses, and I think it was because of the attempt to get the historic vegetation back in there. Sometimes that's not going to be possible. Another way to understand what's going on in these areas, I think, is to defer to the Roy Turkington conceptual model of driver versus passenger. Sometimes exotic, noxious species seem to be driving change in ecosystems, and sometimes maybe they're just a passenger. They're just a consequence of other changes. So we know, we're familiar with the tamarisk driver model, that tamarisk is responsible for changes in water availability, in fire intensity and frequency, in salinization of soil and aquifers, and of completely changing the animal communities and the organisms in the soil. There are folks who have been very insistent on suggesting that tamarisk can also be, or maybe is predominantly, a passenger, that we have human-induced changes that result in climate changes, result in changes in water, that then result in increased salinity, changes in fire regime, changes in the biota, and all of those things contribute to creating an opportunity for the tamarisk to establish. So what I'd like to suggest is that it may be that in the Mojave, the tamarisk is acting more as a passenger, that the environment is harsh, that the natives are pre-adapted to stress, and the tamarisk are less locally adapted. And so that environment hasn't been changed that much by the tamarisk itself. When there are changes, it's perhaps more predominantly things that we have done, whereas in the Chihuahuan, it's very clear that the tamarisk is driving change there. It may have, as a seedling, have been a passenger to anthropogenic change, but it appears to be acting very much as a driver, which can prevent conditions conducive to reestablishing what was historically there. And maybe the Colorado Plateau is in between. We've got a little bit of both going on. So I'd like to present an idea of a combined passenger-driver model, that in some places and at some life stages, tamarisk is acting more as a passenger of change, but then once it becomes established, once it becomes these huge thickets, that are meant for fire and salinize the soil, et cetera, completely changing the animal communities that are there, that it's acting as a driver. So that both can be happening, and that which is happening, which is the dominant mode, will have implications for restoration. So this is a theory we're testing. We're working on this in my lab right now. So what are we doing right now, and what does it have to do with regional differences? Well, here in Colorado, we have a project going on that's comparing sites on the west slope and the east slope. We have two different environments. One has a little bit more water, but let's see what happens in restoration. Well, first we'll look at the genotypes. We have hybrid swarm going on, but a little bit more, perhaps the more invasive ones over here on the east slope. So let's see, what have we been seeing in this project? This is something we've been doing since 2009 on 18 sites, 9 on the east and 9 on the west, looking at plant community changes over time. Well, the first most dramatic difference between east and west that we noticed was that we had, starting out before the tamarisk were removed, much greater native cover relative to the whole plant community on the west slope relative to the east slope. So because we know that with passive revegetation, and all these sites that we're looking at are just passive revegetation, remnant communities are important. So does this mean that the west slope is going to have more success? Well, actually we found really great results after just 1 year in both the west and the east slope. We're seeing here the change in relative cover of native species before versus after tamarisk removal. These are east sites versus our west sites. The only exception to this was on one ranch where they did aerial application of imazapyr, and afterward resistant kochia came in. We're not necessarily super concerned about that. We will watch it over time. But if we look at Larson Ranch, we had native cover go down, and now it's coming back up again. So let's watch that over time, see what happens. So if we just look at, in the last couple minutes that we have, at some changes over time there, and how we have improvements of the sites. We have natives coming in, and if we look at graphs that show us native cover of the understory specifically. The previous graph was both overstory and understory. This is an understory exclusively. We see natives in the green going up over time after tamarisk are removed, which is great. Those were in the east slope. Now in the west slope, have the tamarisk coming out, and again increase. In the west slope, it's more that the dominance has simply been shifted. Take out the tamarisk, and now these native shrubs are the dominant species there. Is primarily responsible for these trends. But what's more interesting to me is, so that previous one was big gypsum. This is a big gypsum site where no tamarisk was removed. It looks the same a year later. But the native dominance has gone down. So not only did removing tamarisk make natives go up, but if we hadn't, the native dominance might have gone down. So that's really something. On the west slope, though, we also had sites where we didn't see that. Here's Disappointment Valley, which doesn't look like a disappointment. When we look at the photo, it looks really nice there. But if we do look at the data, we can see that native dominance has gone down over time there, just a little bit. And we'll keep our eye on that and see what's going on in Disappointment Valley. It may simply be that, as you saw, there weren't a lot of trees that were taken out, and so the removal of the tamarisk may be just incidental. So to summarize, we saw that revegetation was more consistently successful in the Mojave. That may have to do with regional differences in genotype and weather and the matching of what species we're trying to establish there. That restoration may be more difficult in areas where tamarisk has been more of a driver of change, but our response can be to adapt what species we want to see come back there. That might have to be different than what was historically there. and that remnant natives and or water availability are going to help predict success of revegetation, is what we're seeing on east and west slopes. So my take-home messages are that regional differences are important, and that tamarisk removal can lead to native recovery. I know a lot of you have seen this firsthand, but there are those out there that need convincing that this is a worthwhile thing to do. I'll end with letting you know that we still do have copies of the revegetation manual that Kara Domren, Ken Lair, and Michelle Pranger-Lennon and I put together a few years ago. Where would they find those? Outside the registration table, those are for sale. But I really am excited about our next project. 44 folks, several of whom are at this conference, have contributed to writing the first book exclusively about tamarisk. This is every aspect of tamarisk, everything you ever wanted to know, not only about the ecology and the biology, but also about the history and politics. There's even a chapter on philosophy and ethics, and of course management. So Oxford University Press is publishing this book. They will have it in their little hands next week, and we hope to have it in press and on the shelves by fall. So keep an eye out for that. What we might do, I'm going to put out a little sign-up sheet if you want to be kept abreast of when that book is coming out. We want to make sure that you have a copy when you want one. But we're really, really excited about it. So with that, I thank my students and I thank all of you. Question here?
My name is Casey Conway, and I'm wondering, I know that your focus was primarily on the native species recovery after tamarisk removal, but did your students make any notations about the invasion by other noxious weeds in the area? That's one of the big problems out there with tamarisk in areas.
Absolutely. So it's harder to see on here, but the blue line is the noxious. So in every graph that I've shown, the noxious have been there as well. And so in Disappointment Valley, what, like I said, was kind of a disappointment. They had gone up. But in the other sites, we're seeing the noxious weeds going down. So what some folks are concerned about, and rightfully so, because this does happen in some places, when you take the tamarisk out, you have secondary invasion of white top and other things. And so this is not the right one that's showing native species going down, exotics going up. Here's one. Whoops. Okay. Here are the noxious species going down in the blue here. What we're seeing is much less of that, at least in this first year, than we would have expected. We're doing percent cover for every species, so any information that you want to know, we can tell you. Noxious species, woody species, herbaceous species, by species. Yes, Tom.
I appreciate your conceptual model approach, and I think it's a good one. I would suggest that for the Colorado Plateau, you add the sediment transport component into your model. In dinosaur, with our work with Utah State University, we're showing that in certain hydrologic settings, that the sediment dynamics are being driven by tumors.
Definitely. Thank you for pointing that out. We do have a whole chapter in our book about that, authored by David Merritt, Pat Shafroth, and Dan Auerbach. Yeah, you're right. I should put it in the model. Absolutely. Yes. The beetle, of course.
Now, the question I have related to everybody looked at this is whether or not Chinensis versus Ramesses, whether there's any genetic differences with respect to the effects of the leaf.
I think we might have some speakers that can address that later. Is it today or tomorrow? A little bit of both. Yeah, we have Andrew Norton and Dan Bean and some others that can address that. Absolutely, it's a good question. This will be the last question.
And if you get a chance to compare native plant responses to tamarisk removal with Russian olive removal?
In these sites, the focus was tamarisk removal, and so in this particular project, the latter one, we weren't looking at that. I did have a student, Maggie Gaddis, who exclusively looked at vegetation response after Russian olive removal, and she had fewer sites to look at, and the variability was much greater than even what we were seeing in the tamarisk sites. But yeah, it's a really important question, and we'll be keeping our eye on Russian olive as we go along. But my gut sense from looking at the data that we've collected on sites with Russian olive removal is that because the Russian olive are establishing in more mesic areas, you have opposing forces going on, because what we're seeing is that the natives are definitely promoted by that mesic condition, so that's good. We expect to see more natives coming in, but that people are often not seeing the success and control of the Russian olives that we're seeing consistently with the tamarisk. And so a lot of the restoration sites, we see Russian olive coming back. And so that's problematic. So we've got those two different opposing forces going on in Russian olive removal sites. Yeah, so in our study we were looking at increases in soil nitrogen as well. And usually increases in soil nitrogen are associated with weeds coming in. We haven't necessarily seen a real straight relationship there, but it may be just that we don't have a large enough sample size to pick it up, because we are seeing pulses of nitrogen after we take the Russian olive out. It's definitely happening. Great, thank you all so very much. I hope we get to talk in